Good afternoon to everyone joining us from Europe. Good morning to those following us from the US. My name is Malwina Talik. I'm a research associate at the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe based in Vienna, and I will be moderating today's event. This event is the IDMonSite, an online interview format of our institute. And today's IDMonSite, Déjà-vu or a Breakthrough, will focus on Belarus, on its status quo and future prospects. My guest, which I'm happy to have here with me, joining us from the US, is Katsiaryna Shmatsina. Hello, Katsia.
Hello, great to be here and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Just a short introduction. Katsiaryna is a Belarusian political analyst focused on critical geopolitics and security studies. She's also currently a PhD fellow at Virginia Tech University in Washington, D.C. At this point, before we start, I would like also to give the floor to the managing director of IDM, Mr. Sebastian Scheffer.
Thank you for this very formal introduction, Malwina. As I promised on Twitter when I advertised this event, I will be very, very brief. I just want to use this occasion to, first of all, thank you both very much for taking the time to organize this and talk with each other. I'm very much looking forward to this. And I want to stress that this is an event in our series of regional conferences that we are doing within the framework of the 70th anniversary of the Institute for the Danube region in Central Europe, under the hashtag Locating the Future. The idea is that we have these regional conferences in all of most of our target countries, as many as possible. As you can see on the map behind me, we started just last week in Serbia with a keynote speech by our colleague Melanie Jandl, and I traveled to Kiev, and we had a first discussion in Ukraine. And for obvious reasons, we are not in Belarus this time, but we do this in the virtual space. But nevertheless, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Would like to thank very much again both Katsia and Malwina for their time. And without further ado, I will shut off my microphone and my camera and look forward to the exchange.
Thank you, Sebastian, for those opening remarks. Also, some technical remarks from me. This event is also broadcast live on our YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to post them anytime during this event in the chat window. We will definitely have time towards the end of today's event to answer your questions, but maybe some of them I could also pose at Katsia during our discussion. As Sebastian already mentioned, last week we organized an event in Kiev, and he himself was able to travel to Ukraine. And as already mentioned today, neither me nor Katsia are in Belarus, which I think speaks volumes about the situation in the country, and also shows that it's much easier to travel to a country, travel and organize an open debate in a country which is under attack than in its neighboring state. Just a couple of years ago, Belarus made the headlines as its society refused to accept the result of presidential elections. Those elections were also reported as fraudulent by the international observers. What followed were unprecedented protests in Belarus, but those were met with repressions and arrests from the side of the Belarusian authorities. This is when also many dissidents decided to leave the country, but some of them were brought back against their will. And here I mean Roman Protasevich, a journalist and a blogger who was traveling by plane. This plane was forced to land in Belarus under false pretenses. And just yesterday, on the World Press Freedom Day, he was sentenced to 8 years in jail, which I find quite cynical. That that was just a brief introduction. And now I'll turn to you, Katya. You yourself had to leave Belarus. You live now in the United States. And I'm very grateful that prior to this discussion, you agreed to share also your personal experiences with our audience, which I imagine must have been also a very hard experience. Could you tell us more about your situation? Why did you have to leave? What was your crime, so to say?
Good afternoon, and I want to thank our audience for having interest in Belarus, because like there's so many other developments in the region and so much sort of focus shifting elsewhere. But for us Belarusians, when we see international attention to our country, like it means a lot. And I'm saying this on behalf of the diasporas and Belarusians who are sort of stuck inside the country, who do not have many options to leave or to travel and to connect with the rest of the world. Speaking of my personal experience, so I am a political analyst, and what I've been doing for past, before that, I was working more from the international development field at the American Bar Association and with some international NGOs, but then I felt that I want to do political analysis, mainly focusing on Belarusian foreign policy, and the best thing to do that is to do this in Belarus. And now, that happened. Like I made this career shift maybe 5-6 years ago, and that's when the sort of the interesting experiences started to happen. First, when I realized that the think tank world, the analytical world in Belarus, even back then, looked weird to say the least. In a sense that there were pro-governmental think tanks which sort of had the conditions to exist, the right to register legally, to operate legally, even to lease, like to rent premises for their like operations. And then there were independent think tanks which allowed themselves to sort of criticize the government or to come up with some policy suggestions, which would obviously like would never be taken into account by the regime, but at least like we gave ourselves this liberty to speak and to say what we think is like the best policy solution. And again, like there's this discrepancy. There's very little expectation. There was little expectation that it would be taken seriously by the Belarusian policymakers. And so I joined one of those think tanks. I was a fellow at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. And I'm bringing this like background just to illustrate that this was the time of the so-called normalization of Belarus relations with the West, the rapprochement of the Lukashenko regime with EU and the US. And you could feel this sense of normality in the air when the repressions were not so visible. They were happening against like targeting some specific activists, or very like the most visible maybe political figures of that time, but it was not so large scale. And we, the expert community, we felt safe. And this in a sense that as long as we're not calling people to go on the streets or to, as long as, again, like we don't participate fully as politicians in the political life, we are safe. And then this changed abruptly during the presidential elections in 2020. And that was scary because the things were happening, I experienced there, it was more like you would read about this in the Soviet time books about the repressions and then the horrible things. So in the first days of the presidential campaign, sort of things were happening according to the Belarusian normality. And what I mean by that is like, oh, it was not so much of a surprise. Yes, the front runners, those who dared to challenge the incumbent Lukashenko, they were put in prison. This happened before. Yes, they were charged with criminal charges again, like this happened before, or people knew that it's not safe to go on a protest, just on a peaceful protest on the street, because they would be caught like 5 minutes later. What was not normal was the scale of brutality and certain, like what was shocking is that there were certain deaths associated, like related to the protest, like when the police applied on like asymmetrical, like not adequate violence, and one of the protesters was like shot in the broad sort of daylight on the street, and there were several other like shady deaths related to the protest, or by some interesting sort of accident. For instance, one of the like head of the local electoral commission, or like electoral maybe head of the electoral commission in like some smaller town, he was found dead, middle of nowhere, somewhere in the woods. After, again, accidentally, he refused to sign a protocol from the polling station, which he he said that this is a fraudulent protocol. And this is something that hasn't happened before on such a large scale, or we didn't experience that much of like drama like during the presidential elections. Yes, we had, let's say, like in 2010, there were maybe like 7 presidential candidates were all detained overnight on the night of the elections. So we've seen like this not normal things happening before, but not on this scale. And so like I'm sort of climbing closer to my personal experience. So I, as a political analyst, I thought I was relatively safe when I just use open sources. I don't do like any, I don't know, like shaded work, or I just use, again, like open sources. I speak to international media about developments in Belarus and share my take on it. I wasn't even involved into, I don't know, like supporting some political candidates. But I saw that one of my colleagues, Stas Gorelik, he was a PhD student at the time in George Washington University. He came to Belarus for summer just to visit his family. And he happened to wrote an op-ed about comparing Belarusian protests with some other developments in the region. And guess what? Like 2 a.m. in the morning, KGB broke into his house. He was beaten, dragged into KGB prison, charged with political, like criminal charges. But then, like, and maybe like a month later, like he was lucky enough like to get out of there because there was a lot of noise, and maybe they found out like, oh, we cannot make like a solid criminal case. Like, anyways, like he was lucky to get out. And there were other developments when one of the journalists, like there were all the people I knew sort of in my circle where I saw like, wow, this is wild. The things are happening. Like one of the journalists from Radio Liberty, he was chased by a police car, and a policeman like put a gun into his face, just threatening him, and like that he was bitten. Just for his work again, like, and the next day he went live with bruises on his face and like sharing what happened to him. Another Belsat journalist, she was bitten by a woman, by the way, like she was at the detention facility, and she was bitten by a woman, like police guard in her stomach, and like she was like having like internal bleeding. It was done on purpose. So like this level of like brutality, there was like sort of like sanctions encouraged from the top of the government, like the country's leadership, but it was sort of encouraged, and the level of brutality wasn't unprecedented. So sort of long story short, that's in these circumstances, I've realized, okay, I'm not safe when I speak on like to international media or when I publish articles, and I had to leave. And at this day, like as we speak, there are no political analysts, independent one, like not pro-governmental ones left inside the country, because like we all had to leave. And I mean like scholars, researchers, independent experts, or like think tankers. At least either if you want to be safe, like either you have to leave the country, or just stay silent and not to publish your work, not to be visible, like fly like way below the radar. And I want to mention 3 of my colleagues. One military expert, Yegor Lebedok, is now sentenced to 6 years in prison. It was his conscious choice to stay inside the country, and he was fearlessly reporting, like commenting on the developments of Belarusian military exercises and subsequent involvement of Belarus in the war. He knew what was coming, and yes, of course, like he got into jail. And just last month, 2 of my colleagues, Valeria Kostugova and And one more colleague, they were sentenced, Katsiaryna Shmatsina, they were sentenced 10 years in prison. Again, they knew what was coming, and it was their choice to stay inside the country. I knew that that was not an option for me, and yeah, just I was not ready for this type of sort of consequences of my work. But it just gives a lot of motivation to continue doing my best, like to advocate from abroad and to continue my analytical work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this with us. I mean, I also hear that very often from other people who left the country, that they can help much more or a lot also when they are abroad than if they were detained inside the country. I mean, it also makes me think, that things that we take for granted in some countries, like freedom of press, right to expression, are actually crime in other countries, in countries like Belarus. But what I also find striking, when it comes to Lukashenko and his regime, that on the one hand, he portrays himself as a good father, taking care of the nation. Like just recently, I saw those photos of banners at the border between Belarus and Poland, stating that our dictatorship, in inverted commas, is better than your democracy. So the message was clear, like our system is better than yours. We take care of people you don't. But then on the other hand, he seems to be waging a war against his own people, just to quote the Nobel lecture by Alias Bielatsky, the war of the authorities against, the war of the Belarusian authorities against their own people, language, history, and democratic values has been waged in Belarus for years, end of quote. And this also leads me, to my other question. What is the situation in Belarus for those who stayed, especially those who opposed the authorities right now? And especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, like, did it change the dynamic? Did it bring any new dimension?
I don't know how not to be like overly dramatic here when I have to speak about it. And you just mentioned Alias Bielatsky, needless to mention that he's behind the bars now. Again, he was in prison a couple of years ago. He was a political prisoner before. And also I would say like one of the most visible competitors on the recent presidential elections, Viktor Babarika. He was detained like in the sort of very beginning of the presidential campaign. And what is disturbing now is that we don't even know. So what we know is that 7 days ago, he was brought to the hospital. And we haven't heard much like from prison to hospital, and we don't have any updates on his health and what's happening to him. And this brings me to another question or thing I want to underscore, that in this repressive environment, there are virtually no NGOs or journalists or other like public experts who left in the country, or those who can speak openly. And we do have like Belarusian journalism, independent journalism, but it exists outside of the country. And those journalists who still are ready to operate inside the country, they have to take care, like make many cautious steps to protect themselves, and they cannot like publish under their own names. And this also brings me to the aspect of like Belarus involvement in the war, and that when we want to talk about like what is actually, so when you don't have journalists essentially like left inside the country, it very much limits your understanding like what's happening on the ground. Yes, you can rely on some informal contacts, and you can get some reliable information from there, but it just complicates things and like the access to the actual picture. And same applies to the, let's say, developments of like how Russian army, what Russians are doing in Belarus in terms of like scale up their attacks on Ukraine. And there are some like Telegram chats, there are some activists, grassroots activists who also again have to, they know what they're doing, like the risks they're taking. And there are incidents where some Belarusian citizens who oppose the war openly, they would try to maybe make a picture of movement of like Russian tanks or like Russian equipment on Belarusian territory or Russian airplanes. And if they get in trouble, they get in trouble. They are tracked down. They're also put in prison, depending on like for like 2-3 years in prison sentences and up. And what I mean by that is that there are partisans, including the railroad partisans, who sabotage the movement of the railroads just to to undermine Russia's like military plans, like or at least like to slow down the movement of like Russian military equipment in Belarus. And they were brutally detained, injured, and they got like 20-25 years in prison. So by this, I want to underline that on one hand, yes, we have the regime that supports the Russian aggression, but there are people on the ground who do their best, what's in their like capacity, who try to oppose that. And if they're caught, like if they get in trouble, they pay a very dire price. And I also want to mention public opinion polls, which on one hand, again, like needless to say, it's of course, like you cannot conduct a public opinion poll. Like you cannot just like approach people in broad daylight and ask them about politics if you represent an independent agency. And that was pretty much the case even before this repressions, before 2020 crisis. You have to receive some sort of authorization from authorities. And of course, they would never grant that. So I would say like the polling agencies, they've learned their ways, how to establish contacts, how to approach people, how to construct questionnaires in a way that you won't approach someone in broad day like, hey, did you vote for Lukashenko or not? Like, do you support him? But there are ways, like other sort of sociologically accurate ways to construct a question so that you won't ask names, but you will still get some reflection like, oh, what's happening in terms of like popularity and support of certain political figures. And I would say that if you hear or see, like there's some polls out there posted, like measured by like Belarusian think tanks in exile. I take usually these polls with some sort of like doubt, or like you can say like you can observe the trends, what's happening there, but you still understand like in what repressive conditions it was happening, like conducted, restrictive environment, and it could be not fully maybe accurate. But those polls show that majority of Belarusians, like over 80%, they don't want this involvement in the war. And also, again, like to add some more drama, like some more pictures to this sort of painting we're discussing today, we have around 2,000 political prisoners now. What I mean by 2,000, like human rights defenders recognize officially, or I mean, like, according to human rights organizations, the way they count, it's around like maybe 1,500 political prisoners now. But there are a bunch of other people who might not want to be counted as political prisoner because it adds up some vulnerability and potentially some special unfavorable treatment in prison. Could also imply like affect the longevity of the sentence, like the severance of the sentence people get. And over the course of last year, around 2,000 people were detained one way or another, either charged with criminal or administrative charges for expressing their condemnation of Belarus involvement in the war and overall condemning Russian aggression. And this brings me again to the point that you mentioned before, what Ales Bilatsky said is like, Lukashenko is fighting with his own people, more so than more so than actually like fighting, I don't know, or like caring about the Belarusian independence, and happy to talk about this when we talk about like foreign policy dimension. But speaking of domestic affairs, so like it's hard to overstate how dramatic situation is on the inside. And again, like from my observations, when I had a chance to work with some opposition political parties before I was like doing like before during the times of normalization of relations, there were times when even the local elections, not even the parliamentary or the presidential elections, there were times when the observers or the groups of activists who would get together just to compile, like to put together like alternative reports from the polling stations, those of them who were, let's say, sitting at home and just like processing this report, like KGB knew whom to target, and they would break into, or like the police would break into their house, or even try to switch off electricity so they don't have access to internet and cannot put together this report on the day of elections. And again, like when someone like an external observer looking at Belarus, they would wonder like, oh, why don't people protest, or like why it was so peaceful? Well, they were, or like why things are, there's no such, I don't know, thing like as the open opposition in the broad daylight to what's happening in Belarusian territory, like Russian military moving there. There are not so many avenues or tools you can sort of speak up in this restrictive environment. And also speaking of people, like the overall like mood. Again, like hard to, like of Belarusians inside the country, again, like hard to measure it, and also would be overly idealistic to expect that like people stay sort of mobilized, like those who used to protest, like many had to flee the country. We don't know the actual numbers. We just know like the estimates vary by the country. Of course, the Belarusian government won't publish those figures, but they know that many people had to flee. And I mean, like those who took part in the protests, starting from the most visible political critics of the regime, and also people who would go on the protest and maybe make one picture, post one picture from the protest on Instagram. Many of them like felt unsafe; they had to flee the country. And detentions continue by today. Those who thought they like fled to Poland, and they thought like, oh, it's been like 3 years almost, maybe I can go visit my family, and then they're detained at the border. And you never know, like this is like a very random like roulette. You don't never know like when it's going to hit you. And it reminds me very much like about the like Soviet time like repressions, when I remember like reading about this in the books, like, oh, how things looked like, I don't know, like in the 20s or in the 50s. And now you experience this sort of firsthand, like this is happening to myself or people I know in the country. And last but not least, just want to mention this like workers movement, or like the workers strikes that were appearing like here and there during the protest time during the summer 2020. So it's not forgotten in a way, like the regime is targeting those people by today. And I just remember that some of the most outspoken critiques, like the leaders of this or workers movement, they had to flee in the very first days. And one of them, like I was helping one of their families, like families of one of these workers, they said, we were like chased to the border by some shady car, like we think like it was a KGB or something. So that was the way to target the activists, like to remove, like maybe to force them to flee, just to sort of to make sure that this movement is like disorganized. There's no leadership there and the sense of fear. And then by today, sort of the leadership of those SOEs, like state-owned enterprises, they tend to rotate the like the staff, the employees, and even today, like people are questioned, like they brought to, I don't know, to the factories, like management asked like, oh, who did you vote for in 2020? Why did you go to the protest? Like, where's your loyalty? Like, do you support the regime or not? We won't extend your contract. And it just like hits you. Like, it's been like 3 years. Everyone forgot, like, not like forgot what happened, but like moving on with their ordinary lives, like everyday lives. And still there's no sense of security. You don't know what's happened to you or your neighbor, and I think it speaks volumes like about the overall atmosphere on the ground.
You mentioned also that about 80% or more than 80% of people, probably of Belarusians, probably oppose the involvement of Belarus in the invasion of Ukraine, a possible involvement. But there have been very many insinuations so far, like will Belarus join or not? Actually, very many military operations are conducted from the territory of Belarus already. It is also used as a deployment place. There have been already confirmed statements that tactical nuclear weapons could be deployed on the territory of Belarus. Could you? What is your take? Like, is it possible? Can Belarus actually say no to Moscow if Moscow decides that Belarus should get involved? Does Belarus have any leverage to oppose such an action?
So I cannot imagine a situation where Lukashenko would meet Putin and it would say, "Hey, Pelota, do you mind just removing your army from Belarusian territory? Because we don't quite like it. Like, we've changed our foreign policy priorities." And I really cannot imagine this happening. So it's a sort of very oversimplistic way to portray the sort of that these relations are not equal, and it's not the Belarusian side that dictates the priorities, what's going to happen. And speaking of the public opinion polls, so that 80%, again, hard to measure, but then this was sort of measured by different polling pollsters. And what I find funny is that even those who sort of justify, those respondents who sort of justify this, oh, maybe Russia is right, maybe they're fighting for the good cause, they're not ready to fight themselves. It looks more like being an expert, sitting on the couch, oh yes, I support this side, but I'm not really ready to fight. I don't want my son or my husband or myself to go to to join Russian army in this fight. And in terms of the readiness or the capabilities of Belarusian army, it's sort of there has been quite a lot of evidence and assessments, military experts that Belarusian army is not really prepared for the offensive operations, so they would make really little value for the Russians. But again, there were some speculations if they're used, if they're somehow ordered to do so, they would be more of a cannon meat just to. They would be very easily targeted and targeted by the Ukrainian army, but and it's, I think there is still the possibility of that, but it's, in my understanding, it's more of a decision of the last resort, or some sort of, I don't know, what kind of tactical need should arise for essentially Putin to throw this Belarusian army. It's much more useful to use Belarus as a launching pad and to launch attacks. Also because, as we can see, now Ukrainian side does not attack Belarusian side, right, at this moment. So it's kind of useful for Putin to use this asymmetrical advantage. And I would also bring up that no matter what, the Belarusian army, they're not so motivated. They barely, I don't think they would buy into this promises, or what's their rationale for participating, really. Because if you live in Russia one way or another, you might buy into the imperial discourse of you're fighting for the righteous cause. For Belarus, there's no very little angle for that. And so I don't think like the soldiers would have much motivation, but again, like who cares if they're ordered to do so. But there were also reports in the first days of the war. Again, like it's not that we can read this in the open sources. It was more of like insider information that the military command in Belarus, with different levels, they were like sort of reporting on the top. They saying like, we don't want to participate in this war. Again, like it's not, I think this could be overrun. I think like the very fact like why Belarus hasn't joined the war is because like, we're sort of useless on one hand, like not prepared, not capable enough, and maybe that's for the good in a way. But also, like, why not to use this advantage when you just keep Belarus as a zone, which is like there are no attacks on Belarusian territory. You still have some room for maneuvering for that. And speaking with some Lithuanian colleagues and other colleagues in the region, I would say that there sort of the expectation is that Belarus could be used, or maybe not even Belarusian army, but there could be provocations as the war progresses. There could be rather some provocations on the border, let's say like Belarus-Polish, Belarus-Lithuanian border, and also Belarusian authorities could easily sort of give away like the Belarusian passports to some of the Russian colleagues, so to say. And I'm not talking like they could like I would rather lean towards the probability of like using Belarusian territory for some sort of like shady attacks, and maybe like even trying to like send up some diversion groups to Lithuania, for instance. So I would expect rather this type of scenario of involvement.
Yeah, but there are also some Belarusians fighting in Ukraine, right? But they are fighting on the side of Ukrainians, as far as I know. There's this regiment. But how about actually about the relations between Belarusian authorities and Ukrainian authorities and Belarusian opposition and Ukrainian authorities? Because Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was supporting Ukraine from day one. We can't say the same thing about Lukashenko, obviously. But at the same time, I had this feeling that Kiev has been rather cautious when it comes to its relation with the Belarusian opposition. Is it just my impression, or could you maybe explain what's the reason for that?
My observation was from the beginning of the protests in Belarus in 2020 that Kiev rather prioritized, that's what a rationally government would do, prioritize like their own like national interest. And at that time, they would choose rather to continue collaboration with continue contacts and trade and relations with the Lukashenko regime, who also was giving like multiple times like reassurances that, oh, Ukraine would never be attacked. Like he literally said this, like Lukashenko literally said this in meetings with Zelensky a couple of years ago, like Belarus would, like Ukraine would never be attacked from Belarusian territory. And also in the beginning of Belarusian protests, many Belarusians had like chose to flee to Ukraine because it was rather accessible, visa-free. And there was evidence, there was one shady incident of the death of activist Vitaly Shashov in Kiev. And Bellingcat launched an investigation in that. Like we haven't seen much progress on that, but according to Bellingcat sources, there was evidence that Russian agents infiltrated into Belarusian diasporas abroad, including Ukraine, and in terms of like perception of Ukrainian authorities of let's say like Belarusian activists or overall like situation in Belarus, they were rather cautious because they knew like, oh, this is the way for the Russians to sort of infiltrate or like to pretend to be like a Belarusian activist. And that was even before the war. And again, like I would say, like Kiev was rather moderate into in supporting the Belarusian, or rather cautious in reacting overall to these developments in Belarus. And that was one of the first actually questions I remember in 2020 when I talked to some, I also had to, like, I chose to flee to Kiev first when I left Belarus. And that was one of the first questions some Ukrainian diplomats and European diplomats based in Kiev asked me, like, they said, like, do you think this instability in Belarus, it creates some sort of chaos that Russia could seize the chance to attack, like to launch attacks broader in the region, to be more aggressive in the region? So that was one of the sort of strategic calculations from the Kiev side, like, or thinking like, oh, it's not that, like, it's not so much of a fantasy that things could happen. In terms of relations, like Kiev, like view on Belarusian opposition, they had their, I would say, like, it just happened so, like, from the very beginning. There was no, like, the relations didn't seem to be on good track from the very beginning. And maybe some words were said, like maybe the level of contact or the quality of contacts established by the opposition in the first days was not, like, it just didn't get on the good track. And you can see the legacy of this by today, when some Belarusian activists are denied like residency permits today, or when there's some sort of not so like pleasant statements made by the Ukrainian side towards the Belarusian opposition. Like, it's just good to acknowledge that, like, oh, it's there. Like, maybe this relationship could improve over time. And also for Kiev, like, it makes more rational sense to make contacts with someone who still has, like, very pragmatically speaking, like, to has actual grip and power on the ground. And by this I mean, like, the regime of Lukashenko, versus an idealistic leader who is calling for some righteous actions from abroad, but they don't have actual control what's happening on the ground. And I would also bring up some assessments of Belarusian propaganda. I've seen recently somewhere in the news, they were sort of bragging that, oh, the very existence of the Ukrainian embassy and that Ukrainian diplomats hasn't left Belarus now, it's a good asset for us. It shows that Belarus could still be maybe a place of informal dialogue of the Russians and the Ukrainians on Belarusian territory. And I don't know, like, how to comment on that. I don't know how, is there actual, like, communication there happening? But obviously, like, if you still have some sort of representation, like if you have an embassy, like premises or consulate, it still gives you some access to information, some better, like, it's better to have some sort of presence, even if it's the aggressor state, rather than not to have any representation at all.
But do you think that if Zelensky had more cordial relations with Tsikhanouskaya, that this could be seen by Lukashenko as a reason to go to war, to join actively? I know that we talked that this is probably not possible, but do you think that would be a casus belli for Lukashenko?
I don't think that. Like, I've heard that this is the calculation from the Zelensky side, like Zelensky administration side, that if we are more spoken, like if we support the opposition of Belarus, then this could sort of invoke or trigger Lukashenko to be more decisive in the war. It's not, and I would also bring up that for Lukashenko, the war, I don't think that's in any way favorable for him. And he also understands, like, if he joins the war, the losses of the Belarusian army, it won't reflect good on his support domestically. And here again, I don't want to say that he is widely supported or that people are not tired of him, but imagine, like, people, like, imagining, like, the bodies of soldiers coming back in coffins, like, to their relatives, and like it rather would destabilize the situation inside the country, inside Belarus. So I think, like, that's what keeps him away from the war. Again, like, I don't see what exactly Lukashenko could win from the war, rationally speaking. And he's a very rational politician. Like, he's not, if he was sort of not smart enough, he wouldn't stay in power for that long, really. And he's proven to be quite talented in balancing. And by this, I mean, like after Crimea annexation, he managed to like sell himself internationally. He managed to initiate the rapprochement of relations with the West because he said like, well, we could provide the platform for Minsk dialogue. We could be sort of this impartial sort of platform. And it also raises some fears, these fears among like Belarusian activists that like, what if he tries his way to wiggle out of it even now? Like, let's say if Putin makes some unrational choices, or if they're in the war, or if there's some sort of peace talks, what if Lukashenko would still be able to present himself internationally as a victim, for instance, of Russian aggression? And what if at some point there would be another cycle of dialogue with the West, where he would again like trade political prisoners in exchange of political favors? Again, like we're not at the stage, luckily now, but this is the fear again, like that at some point, like Belarusian fight for freedom or this demand, like the sacrifices would be forgotten for the sake of sort of political rationale and the realpolitik, let's say.
But you mentioned that he's very rational, and this is one of the reasons why he still hangs on to power. But I was wondering because many activists, many human rights defenders were trying to challenge his power for a long time. There were these massive protests, and they were still not able to remove him from power. I mean, we could see in Ukraine years ago that it was possible to remove de facto dictators from power. Why is Lukashenko so, I would say, successful in staying at power?
I want to say that this, in my understanding, it's almost never about, like in the authoritarian state, which has the capacity to infiltrate or take control over almost every part of the society. And by this, I mean the control, like the ideological control or special services, like influence over universities, especially like state universities, but actually like all universities, even like private owned, or again, like this level of control when an activist won't even have a chance like to go on the street. They would be like preventively targeted at home. There were multiple instances where people were detained before the elections, like the most active sort of figures, like the critics of the regime, they would be detained even before they get out of their homes, even before the presidential or parliamentary campaign would begin. So it's never, in the society like that, it's never enough, like it's not unfortunately enough to have popular discontent, and it could be crushed by violence, by like police violence or special services. But I would say that like there is this Russian factor, like without Russian support, if it was not for Russia's support in 2020 for Lukashenko, I don't think he would have survived. I don't think he would have many chances, because again, like there were instances where like diplomats would leave their positions, or the journalists, like TV anchors, even from the state TV, they would leave in the first days of protests to express their position. They do not support the state violence against the protesters. And the level of discontent at every level of society was so high, but it was just crushed with violence. And this, again, like if there was no Russian factor out there, with like Moscow making reassurances internationally or making cautious, sort of sending cautious signals to the West, like, hey, Belarus is our de facto sphere of influence, you don't want to mess with us. And that's pretty much like the rationale, what the Western policymakers, how they looked at Belarus in the days of protest. They were communicating sort of informally, that's what I saw, observed like sort of firsthand. They were communicating to the Belarusian opposition leaders, like, please do not get sort of violent, do not get, like, please stay peaceful. Like, I don't know, like just carry flowers in the streets, essentially, and we will support you with like some sort of like solidarity messages, but you don't want Russia to get involved into let's say, like to make more decisive moves to take over Belarus. Let's say if things get out of control, if there is a way to transition to the democratic government.
There's one question from my colleague Kinga Brudzinska. Apart from Russia, which countries are natural partners for Minsk nowadays in political or economic sense? And what I just remember is that Lukashenko was in China a while ago, right? Is possible? I will also add a question for me at this point, like is China an alternative to Russia and the partner that Lukashenko can rely on?
Well, there is some evidence that in order to bypass sanctions, Belarusian and Russian companies sort of find their workarounds in Central Asia, that they would somehow like ship goods there or like change the labels, and that would allow them to even like to continue like trade with the West. But in general, like very generally speaking, after the isolation occurred, like over the course of past 2 years, like the regime is looking ways to like where we can go to essentially like Africa, Latin America, or Asia to sort of rebalance or to compensate for the losses for isolation with the West. It's like very broadly speaking, and what I mean by that, again, like there's not so much or this much like reliable information you can get, especially when like the sources on the ground are limited. You have to sort of rely on some like insider information in that. In terms of China, again, it's needless to say that the relationship between, let's say, the hierarchy, there is a hierarchy of relations there, like Xi Jinping, Putin, and then Lukashenko. And it's hard to imagine that like Lukashenko has a chance to conduct his own sort of to set the tone in the conversation, and let alone to let's sort of like bypass like Putin in this relationship with Beijing. And as for the content of this meeting, well, I think like it's definitely a sort of a diplomatic win for the Belarusian side, for the Belarusian regime, so to say, like to have this kind of like high level contact. I don't know what was the actual content of this negotiations. I mean, definitely I wouldn't rely on the public on the public statements and press releases on that matter. But it came at the time like this visit was organized again. It's like rather it was in the context of Ukraine war and the time and the time when China came up with a peace plan for Ukraine. And in my understanding, like either it was done for some sort of like arrangements how exactly like Belarus could play a role or like aid Putin in the war. There were again like talks about like, oh, maybe Belarus could like this has to do with like shipping some military equipment to Belarus versus to Russia. I think it has to do more with like Beijing setting the line, like, well, here is the side we support. And in terms of Belarus, for last couple of years, they were making the statements that we support they support the Belarusian regime. They oppose the Western interference, so to say, and unlawfully impose sanctions on Belarus. And I will also bring here and this visit actually came as a huge surprise for me in a way that for the past couple of years, when the instability kicked in Belarus, China de facto, like sort of they downgraded the contacts. Like they were quite limited with the Belarusian leadership. And what is interesting, like they essentially like put on hold or trying to pull out the investments from Belarus, because Belarus at the time was mostly interesting for China as a gateway to Europe for logistical centers, for trade. And there were, again, like some sort of messages from diplomats about even like the Chinese, I think maybe Chinese diplomats, they asked Moscow at some point to stabilize the situation, stabilize the protests in Belarus because it was harming Chinese economic interests in Belarus. And especially with the activity of the railroad partisans who would like stall the train movement. And again, like it hurt the logistical like sort of plans, the logistics China had in Belarus. And then after the protest, they actually, like the Chinese side tried to reroute their sort of logistics towards Ukraine and also to pull some investments, like to redirect them towards Ukraine, but then the Ukraine war happened. And I'm saying again, like this meeting with Lukashenko, with Xi Jinping, like it came as a surprise because China did not show any previous interest. They rather put on hold any type of contacts and tried to disengage from Belarus in the past 2 years.
Yeah, let us now try to locate the future, as this is the slogan of this event series, 70 years of the IDM locating the future. And based on everything that you have said so far and what we know about Belarus, what do you think the future could be? Like, will we see a déjà vu? So will we see a repetition of what have already happened so far? Or do you think there can be a breakthrough that things might change?
So I will start with the worst scenario, which I really hope would not happen, but it's like a good sort of wake-up call, especially something I say when I speak to Belarusian democratic forces. Like the worst case scenario is, let's say, the win of Ukraine, or no matter, like if Ukraine wins, even in that case, it doesn't mean anything for Belarus. It doesn't guarantee a good outcome. And even worse, Belarus could be like a bargaining chip in talks. Like even let's say like Russia could be weakened enough in this war, but they could be strong enough or like still have the capacity to keep Belarus in its orbit. Another, again, like that scenario, and then I'll move to the good ones, is that Lukashenko, essentially like the regime survives once again this crisis in relations with the West and isolation, and that they would apply their old tactics of like trading political prisoners or making the West just sort of to turn the page. Let's forget about the problematic past, because guess what? We can still guarantee some sort of peace and stability in Belarus, and you don't want things to get worse with Russia. You don't want an enemy like on NATO eastern flank. But then again, like it's hard to now when the talks about like Russia placing nuclear missiles here and there, like in Belarus, it makes things more complicated. But that's the fear of the Belarusian civil society or the opposition or like the activists, that once again, like the rationale, it's real politic rationale would play out not in our favor. Like, oh, this sacrifices like the movement would be forgotten, the achievements of the protest would be forgotten. And again, like I want to say this because I saw, again, firsthand during the normalization of relations when it was more convenient for certain European diplomats and politicians to talk to the regime and to sweep under the rug the grievances or the arguments that the government's critique would bring up to the table. When the human rights activists or human rights defenders or opposition politicians, they were taken much less seriously because like it's inconvenient. Why, like if you can have a decent dialogue and trade and some sort of like political dialogue with someone who has actual grip on power, let's just move this like dissidents, inconvenient dissidents, like a little bit far like from our like table and just disregard them. So like that's speaking like of the bad things, but then the good things and maybe idealistic ones is, I would say, like the regimes, like if we look at the historical examples, like the Berlin Wall or the Cold War, and like the regime, this type of regimes, and Belarusian regime is very sort of like Soviet style type of thing. So they looked solid until the very collapse. It's like they looked solid until they disappeared overnight, and because of some like internal sort of dissent, like dissolution of those pillars that keep it together. And also, so it just brings some sort of like black swan type of thing factor. You don't know what happens and when this window of opportunity opens, but it could happen. And again, like there should be some change. I hate to say that, but like a lot depends on Russia's influence over Belarus, or what we can do, or what happens in terms of like what's the way for Belarus to Belarusian pro-democratic actors, what's our way to leverage against Russia? Now the odds are not in our favor. But I want to finish on a good note, saying that this protest, even though it was not successful, but we can, again, like we can see so many other parallels even in the Polish history, like the Solidarność movement or similar resistance experiences, that they might not be successful overnight, or they were not maybe successful the very year this movement emerged, but they accumulated their strengths and momentum, and they prevailed, maybe at some unexpected times. And I think that this is what would happen with the Belarusian democratic movement.
Thank you for this very positive note at the very end, giving us some hope. Before we finish, I would also like to ask you for some recommendation for those who want to learn more about Belarus, about the current situation, but just about the country and its society. Like, what book or movie or artist would you recommend us to follow, to take a look at?
I would say like one of my favorites, Sasha Filipenko, amazingly talented Belarusian writer. And it's not necessarily like strictly about politics, but it's more about like a look, like to get a better sense of like Belarusian society. And his books are like, you could find them in many stores like in Europe, and also translated in various languages, not only English or German. So that's one thing. And I also was thinking about two female authors. One German, Alice Bota. She wrote a book about women in Belarus, and I think her book is published in German. I've seen this in a couple of stores. Not sure about Austria, but definitely in Germany. And another, Olga Shparaga, also a Belarusian philosopher, and her book about Belarusian revolution has a woman's face. So she just documents sort of the first days, the first maybe year of the Belarusian protest, and gives like catches the spirit, like the vibes you could see like on the streets and inside the opposition movement at the time.
Great, thank you. I mean, we will make sure that all the names will be added to the description of this video on YouTube, so our audience can also know who to look for and where. Katsia, thank you very much, first of all, for sharing your personal experiences, but also for sharing your expertise. It was a great pleasure to have you here with us. Yeah, and I hope all the best to Belarus, and also to you and other Belarusians who are in exile at the time, and also those who are in Belarus. Also, thank you very much to our audience for your questions and for following information on Belarus. You can find much more also on our website. And for your information, there will be many more events within this framework of 70 years of the IDM Locating the Future. The next one will be in Hungary already in 3 weeks. So please stay tuned, follow our social media, and follow our website. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.